Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast. I'm Tom Kegley, your host. In the SPaMCAST 777, we re-release SPaMCAST 486, Daniel S Vacanti, Actionable Agile Metrics. The idea of flow metrics has fundamentally changed my perspective on how to use metrics. I have to thank Mr. Vacanti for starting me on that path. Enjoy the interview. We are currently toiling away editing audio and doing voice exercises to bring you new and exciting content next week. Enjoy today's interview. Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 486. Today, we feature our interview with Daniel S. Vacanti. Mr. Vacanti is the author of Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability and Introduction. You may have heard about this book. You may have participated on the reread, and if you didn't, you can still go back and reread through all of the entries in our reread as you read the book. We discussed the concepts in the book, answered a question from Stephen Adams, and talked about his new book. It was great to talk about a book after a reread with the author. Daniel S. Vacanti's bio. Daniel Vacanti is a 20-plus year software industry veteran who has spent most of his career focusing on lean and agile practices. In 2007, he helped develop the Kanban method for knowledge work and managed the world's first project implementation of Kanban that year. He has been conducting lean agile training, coaching, and consulting ever since. In 2011, he founded Actionable Agile, which provides industry-leading predictive analytic tools and services organizations that utilize lean agile practices. In 2015, he published his book, Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability, which is the definitive guide to flow-based metrics and analytics. Daniel holds an MBA and regularly teaches a class on lean principles for software management at the University of California, Berkeley. Are you ready to talk actionable agile metrics and predictability? It's time for the interview. Daniel S. Vacanti, author of the Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability and Introduction. Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
It's great to be here, Tom. Thanks very much for the invitation to join you today.
Dan, we have been rereading your first book, or at least... What is it, the first book, or had you done other books before that one?
That is the first book, yes, that I've written, yes.
Excellent.
First.
And we'll, I guess, explore the second one a little bit also as we go. You know, you do one, it's sort of like Pringles potato chips or Lay's potato chips. You can't stop after one.
I don't know if I'd say that. I thought the second one would be easier to write. And in many ways, the second book is the book I probably should have written first. Mm-hmm. But the second one actually ended up being just as hard and in many respects even harder than the first. So I don't know if that's typical of most authors, but that was certainly my experience.
Interesting. I don't know. I'm in the middle of a second with my co-author, and I don't know that it's easier or harder. We're arguing over different things. I would also suggest that having a co-author is a little different thing. So you've luckily done yours by yourself.
Well, I don't know. I've got like 4 or 5 voices in my head, so I don't know if that counts as co-authorship or not. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. Let's start with something pretty basic in terms of actionable agile metrics, and that is the whole idea of predictability. Can we dive in with what is predictability and why it's important?
Yeah. So I've come to learn, especially between the first book and the second book, since we've just been talking about it, that my notion of predictability, I think, is quite a bit different than most other people's. And I think we'll probably hit that as a continuing theme throughout this podcast. But in general, the way that I view predictability is, well, actually, let me take a step back. I think most people think predictability is the accuracy to which you can correctly forecast a system's future state. So they think you're predictable if you can make really, really accurate forecasts about the future. And while that's true, I don't think that's really the most important part of predictability or even necessarily the best definition of predictability. In my humble opinion, a better definition of predictability is that the process or the system that we are operating behaves the way that we expect it to. Now, there's kind of a subtle difference, and maybe we can dive into that a little bit, if we have time. But I think it's really more about, like I said, setting up your process such that the items that are moving through it, the value that you are delivering behaves the way that we expect it to, behaves the way that we've designed it to. Because it's when it strays away from performing the way that we expect it to, that's where all the goodness in terms of improvement and things like that are going to come along. So I don't know. Does that answer? I rambled.
No, that's perfect.
Quite a bit there,
and it's somewhat provocative. Before I pull one of those threads, behaves the way that we expect it to behave.
Yeah.
That's, I think, sort of a fraught, or at least it has a lot of interesting nuances to it, that phrase.
Yes.
Why would we care if it behaved? If we could predict the future, right, and we could predict, why do we care that it behaves the way we think it's going to behave?
Well, I guess so. I might invert that. I would think the reason we can predict the future is because it does behave the way we expect it to. So, for example, and we're maybe jumping the gun here a little bit, but in the book, I especially in my second book, I talk a lot about the different types of forecasts. Like, you can make forecasts for single items. For example, when will this particular user story be done, or when will this particular feature be done, or whatever. But you can also make forecasts for multiple items. That is, when will the next 100 items in my backlog be done? Or, we have a release coming up on April 1st. Well, how many items can we get done by April 1st, right? Those are forecasts about multiple items. And the way that we are going to go about answering those questions is by first designing a process or a system, like I said, that behaves the way we expect it to. So if I design a process where 85% of my items, like say 85% of the stories that are flowing through my process, take 8 days or less to complete, well, then 85% of the items flowing through my process better take 8 days or less to complete. And that being the case, then that becomes my forecast, if that makes any sense. Do you see what I'm saying?
Oh, no, absolutely. I see what you're saying. More to the point, if we expect a behavior, how are we supposed to act when that behavior isn't what we see?
Well, and that's why these metrics, I think, are so important, because what we're looking for is an objective measure of whether that expectation is being met or not. Because, you and I could have very different subjective opinions in terms of how our process should behave. But by rooting the conversation in terms of the metrics that I talk about in the book, things like work in progress and cycle time and throughput, now we can have, I think, a much more meaningful and a much more, that's how I say, non-emotional conversation about, really, is the process behaving the way we would expect it to? We have data here that shows our items should take 8 days or less 85% of the time. But for the past couple of weeks or for the past month, they've actually been taking 12 days. So what's going on here? What do we need to do about that?
Arguably, people use words or use concepts in a fuzzy way. Mm-hmm. I've recently run into people who want to have discussion about values. Let's discuss transparency. Well, what my idea of transparency is and yours are probably two different things. And without something to track, something to tangibly measure, let's say, or at least describe the behaviors of that process so that we know what to expect, there's really no way to have a conversation. Certainly no way to change it.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And so that's why I think this stuff is so foundational and fundamental, both in terms of being able to answer the important questions that our customers are asking, but probably more importantly, to help us understand where we can improve. And so I think actually that what I just said there, I think answers the second thing that you had asked originally. You asked, what is predictability and why is it important? The why is it important is because, number one, our customers think it's important, right? They care about predictability. In fact, if you go to your customers, most of them will say predictability is probably the most important thing to them. But then number two, without a predictable process, we won't have, I shouldn't say we won't, but it won't be as good a notion in terms of what interventions we should be making in order to make our process perform better.
There is always a lot of pushback when you get into discussions of measuring, whether it's cycle time or anything else. And so therefore, one could make the argument that people aren't that, or at least not everyone is as interested in being predictable as perhaps our customers are. Does that resonate, or do you think that's a sort of a false set of assumptions?
It absolutely resonates, and I think it's fairly unfortunate. And I think it's probably telling of our industry in general that anytime a measurement is taken, people usually believe they're going to be beaten over the head with it. And that's that. Like I said, that's really, really rather unfortunate, because the point of the measurements that I talk about anyway is not to call anybody out. It's not to say, oh my God, you guys really suck at building software, or, whatever you do. It's more about how do we gain a deeper understanding in terms of what's happening with our overall team or process performance. And like I said, how can we use that information in order to get better? So yeah, it absolutely resonates that there's a resistance, a reluctance to measure certain things. And if I could solve the problem of using this information for good rather than evil, I think I'd be a very, very rich man.
Yeah, and unfortunately, even people who just for the life of me will shake their head, nod their head, yes, I understand that we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to. And the first thing they do is to turn around and say, okay, let's collect those measures and let's compare groups.
Yeah.
It's like, oh no, please don't.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to have enough time to get into all the pitfalls of measurement, but there's so many things. I think once you start orienting your perspective around delivering value for a customer and what the best strategies are for delivering value for a customer, there are a whole bunch of assumptions in terms of how processes should operate, and there are a whole many so many paradigms out there that I think just need to be thrown out or rethought, and it's getting people to readjust their mindset around this new way of thinking. I think that is by far the hardest nut to crack in terms of what we're talking about. But we're straying, I think, maybe potentially a little bit off topic. I don't know, but
that's fair.
There's something there.
That's fair. I think, but at some point we'll have to circle back, and perhaps another time. The argument, right, is in the book. There's a lot of discussion about cycle time and measures that revolve around those. One of the takeaways that one could have is that, hey, the only way really to leverage these kind of metrics is if I was using a continuous flow kind of process, something like Kanban or something like that. But I'm using a 2-week sprint and it goes to zero at the end of the sprint. Nothing's in work in process. And then we restock everything and go forward. Can we use these same kind of measures, things that are based on Little's Law, with that kind of an approach, or should we, just sort of abandon, iteration-based methods?
Yeah, so I mean, not only can we, I think we should. I think the metrics that I talk about, I hope, are really kind of agile implementation agnostic, if you will. As a matter of fact, if you go through and you read the original proof of Little's Law, I'm not suggesting that everybody go out there and do that, but if you were to, he actually talks about 2 specific cases in terms of how to apply the law. And believe it or not, the first case of applying Little's Law is when your process starts with 0 items and your process ends with 0 items. And I think a lot of Scrum teams out there might recognize that because I think that is, for a lot of Scrum teams, that's kind of the ideal. I'm not sure if it's required, but that's kind of the ideal, that we start our sprint with 0 items in progress and we finish our sprint with 0 items in progress. And there's a whole application of Little's Law for that specific situation, as well as a whole application of Little's Law where the process never empties, where it is more of a continuous flow-based process. So yeah, the insights that can be derived from understanding Little's Law, maybe not the math itself, but understanding why the math works, I strongly believe, are equally applicable in both contexts.
One of the takeaways, or at least the admonitions that you'd made in the book, is to try to stay away from some of the statistical process control kinds of approaches, even though you're starting to get these the data in scatter plots. Stay away from probably doing the standard deviations, those sorts of things. Why should people stay away from that, and why not use things like averages and standard deviations?
Yeah. So I hope we're not getting too inside baseball here. But so let me start with the second part first. Why not use average and standard deviation, and then hopefully I can back into the control chart thing. So there are several reasons why we don't use a statistic like average in terms of either measuring predictability or trying to make forecasts. And a couple of those reasons are number one, averages they're very influenced by outliers. So you could have it's the classic joke. I think I mentioned it in the book. Like if Bill Gates walks into a bar of 10, where there are 10 people, immediately now everybody in the bar is on average a millionaire. If there's one thing that people will probably recognize when they look at their cycle time data, is from time to time you are going to have these extreme outliers, and unfortunately those extreme outliers will dramatically skew what that average measurement is telling you. Following on with that, why don't we use the standard deviation is because a lot of times people want to use, then they say, hey, well, I've got an average, and then now I can do an average plus a standard deviation and an average minus standard deviation, and that's going to give me a percentage range of probability. The problem with that approach is that people are assuming that their data is normally distributed. And I'm here to tell you, when you go look at your cycle time data, at least if you measure it the way that I explain how to measure it, you will find out that it's almost guaranteed that your data is not normally distributed. In fact, it will look nothing like a normal distribution. And so the danger of applying, say, an average and a standard deviation statistic to non-normally distributed data is it's going to, number one, I think most importantly, or potentially not most importantly, but number one, cause you to make the wrong forecast. But number two, it's going to give you the wrong signal at the wrong time in terms of should we be making an intervention into our process. So I don't know if you want me to keep going with that, because I guess I haven't gotten to the control chart part yet, but I don't know if that's enough, or you want me to keep going. That
is probably enough. And obviously, one of the things I would suggest to the listeners is that they grab a copy and read it. But just as an aside, I have a long, heavy background in statistics. And I'll be honest with you, I very rarely, even in really large samples of data, ever see something that's actually a normal distribution. Albeit, I remember, during my MBA, almost every every stats professor said, "Oh, we'll assume normality." It's like, good God, why? Because
exactly.
Human beings aren't normal; they don't distribute normally that way.
Yep. Yeah. So, an even better reference, if I may, for your listening audience, an even better reference than my book for this stuff is another book called "The Flaw of Averages" by Dr. Sam Savage, and I highly recommend people take a look at that reference, because the basic thesis of that book is plans based on average fail on average. And that's what I think people need to understand. If you're basing all of your plans on average, you have an average chance of failing. And most people, I don't think, understand that. So
you introduced the idea of forecasting almost in our first answer here in the first part of the conversation. If we're predictable, can we forecast? And how far do you think we can forecast?
So I think, by definition, if we are predictable, then at least we have a shot. We have a shot at making an accurate forecast. So I've got several thoughts running through my head here. That's what you're getting at, I think, is probably the most important question that people don't ask when they're asked to make a forecast, is, especially if they're using data-driven forecasting, is they never ask the question, can we trust our data? Can we trust the forecast that our data is telling us? That's one of the reasons why Little's Law is so important. And I can come back to that in just a second. But I guess to get to the essence of your question, if we're doing all of these things, and in my opinion, it's the little things that you do every day, the little decisions, little interventions that you make every day in your process, how your process operates, that is going to make you predictable. And if you take that action, those actions every single day, then for the most part, the act of forecasting becomes fairly trivial. And by all means, you can forecast. Now, how far out in the future you can forecast, how long is a piece of string, that type of thing. Because, and this is a concept I think that I get into more in the second book rather than the first book, is that we are constantly getting new information. As we're operating our process, we're constantly getting new information about how long things are taking, what our scope is, technical challenges, people problems, whatever. And as we get that new information, we should be constantly incorporating that new information into our forecasts and reforecasting. And I think that's the thing that most people don't do. It's not set it and forget it. It's I don't know if you've seen this. I'm trying to get this hashtag to trend on Twitter, and I call it continuous forecasting. And maybe your audience has heard it here first, but Tom, I think this is going to be the next big thing. Is this concept called continuous forecasting?
Excellent. And do you go through that in the second book?
I do.
Excellent.
Ad nauseum, probably, but yes, I do.
Before we ask a couple of questions about the second book, the idea of forecasting and data forecasting makes the assumption that people, they are looking forward and trying to determine the risk. Is something going to change? But that's not really what people tend to hear. Even if they're doing it, it's like, but Dan, you said we'd get 100 things done more than likely in this release 2 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, so that's the question. I was just sitting here laughing, but yes, do you want me to say some more about that? So this is when we're talking about forecasting, I guess specifically, and more in general, I like to talk in terms of probabilistic forecasting. And I think that qualifier, probabilistic forecasting, is of crucial importance because we are talking about a future that is full of uncertainty. And whenever there is uncertainty present, we must assume a more probabilistic, statistical type approach. Can throw determinism out the window. It's impossible for us to say deterministically how long something is going to take or how long is it going to take us to get so many items done. And I think that's what you were kind of getting at with your question is, for the most part, people don't understand what it means to think probabilistically. In all fairness, I'm not even sure that I do totally understand what it means to think probabilistically. But the way that I'm able to distill it down for myself is that the essence of probabilistic thinking is acknowledging that there is more than one possible future outcome. Whenever we start something and whenever we know that there's going to be uncertainty about the future, that means there's more than one possible future outcome. So that's why it's so important that we communicate our forecasts in terms of that, that the range of possible outcomes as well as the percentage chance of those outcomes happening. That's why you heard me say, 8 days or less, 85% of the time. That's really how forecasts need to be communicated. Because if you just say, this user story is going to take 7 days, well, your customer hears, that's going to take exactly 7 days. And then, of course, their expectation is set and they'll be disappointed when that determinism doesn't come true.
Well, how do we educate our consumers of that information away from that? Because that's not what people are trained to hear, whether it be in business or anywhere else, right?
Yeah, great question. I think you've listed 4 or 5 now that if either one of us could solve, we probably would never have to work again. I try to always bring it back to concepts that other concepts in life that maybe people understand. The most cliched of which is like weather forecasting. When you watch a weather forecast, they never say it's absolutely going to rain tomorrow. They say, well, we have an 80% chance of it raining tomorrow. Or for you gamblers out there, anybody who plays blackjack or poker or whatever, has an understanding of, given a certain hand, what are their percentage chances of winning? And they don't necessarily, just because they have a certain hand, they don't necessarily expect to win, but they do understand that some hands give them better chances than other hands. And so to me, it's just constantly reminding people, about that. There are other aspects of your life where whether you know it or not, you are kind of thinking probabilistically, and it's just taking those same concepts and applying it to software development or Agile in general.
Steve Adams, one of the people who've read the blog and listened to the podcast and have been reading along with the book, had a question that he wanted to definitely ask. And while I didn't record him asking it, I will actually read his question and see if we can get an answer for him. Say you exit a work item off the Kanban board as deferred. It comes back a few months later. Are you concerned that this work item already has work in process invested and that'll skew the cycle time? Do you just drop the cycle time? How would you approach that?
So Tom, I'm sure you've done a lot of training in your time, and the answer to every question that you get in a training class is it depends, right? I mean, you probably know that better than anyone. But I think I can do a little bit better in this in this case. If we're really talking about an item, exiting because, like I said, maybe we started to work on it and we realized, this isn't the right thing to be working on, or we found a dependency or whatever. For whatever reason, we decided this probably shouldn't finish. Let's maybe throw it back on the backlog and revisit it at some later date. And especially if it's a few months, I mean, assuming your cycle time is significantly shorter than, a few months, then for the most part, I am not concerned at all that we invested some time up front to work on it. But then now it comes back a few months later and we're going to work on it again, because especially with that significant amount of passage of time, things will have changed. We'll have, like I said, we'll have gotten new information. Our understanding will be better, or we will have forgotten everything that we did before anyway. So I think the fact that we invested any time on that is for the most part moot and irrelevant, and I don't think should cause too much concern that we bring it back in and we start our cycle time clock all over from zero.
And I think Steve will be happy with that. I suspect because I did turn around and say, well, what did you end up doing? And I think he did something exactly like that. So he'll be happy that you agreed with him.
Now, if I can add, I mean, if there are people out there who are really concerned about that, what you can do is when you're working on something and you decide, hey, we're not going to finish this thing normally, it is possible just to have that item exit out of the process normally, but, tag it as canceled or tag it as deferred, but still calculate a cycle time for when you made that deferment decision. And then when it comes back, you can create a totally new item, and just track that cycle time. And that will allow for some potentially interesting analysis, because when we throw up something like a scatter plot or a cumulative flow diagram or whatever, we can then potentially segment the data, and we can say, well, what does our cycle time look like if we include all the canceled stuff? Or what does it look like if we exclude all the canceled stuff? And you might be able to gain some insight in terms of how much those canceled items are really costing us from a cycle time and predictability perspective.
And then do something about it.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you have a lot of those, I'm not sure that, well, I think you have a different fix that you'd want to pursue at that point.
Exactly. But do something about it. That's why we call it Actionable Agile, right? That's exactly why I chose that title.
The new book, when will it be done? How does it relate to this book?
So the Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability, and I called it an introduction because it really, really was meant to be kind of the bare bones basic introduction to some of these concepts. I give basic definitions of cycle time, basic definitions of work in progress throughput. I go through and I can explain the foundations of certain analytical charts like scatter plots and cumulative flow diagrams. Unfortunately, it kind of reads like a textbook. The when will it be done goes much more into the meat and the mechanics of forecasting. What does it mean to, how should we be producing forecasts? What we should be doing to produce those forecasts? How we should be communicating them? Like I said, just the mechanics of forecasting in general. So that's, in some ways, you definitely do need the material from the first book to understand the second book. To the best of my ability, I've tried to either include the crucial parts from the first book in the second book, so you don't constantly have to be going back and looking things up in the first book. So unfortunately, some people might find that repetitive, but as much as possible, I'm hoping that the second book really builds on the concepts of the first, where I left those off.
How much has your thought process on this area evolved since Actionable Agile Metrics?
Yeah, so in terms of the metrics that we should be collecting and how we should be going about doing forecasting, my thinking hasn't evolved that much. Where it really has evolved is in some of the areas I think that we talked about before was how do we introduce this stuff to people? How do we get them to understand it? I think that's where I'm still learning, and I've got a lot to learn. And like I said, I don't think I've really solved that problem yet. What's the best way to get people to start down this path, to really take advantage of the wealth of information that I believe it can provide?
It is a phenomenal book, and I'm looking forward to reading the next book. So, Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability. I've got to admit that I do travel in the software measurement field as one of the areas that I focus on. And until recently, I don't know many that picked it up, but now that I've sort of browbeaten them into buying a copy of the book, I actually had one of my former colleagues that I've worked with, call up this morning and say, "Hey, can you and I talk about page?" And he rattled off a page and wanted to talk through one of the. It is a phenomenal work, and I think it's very helpful, regardless of where people are, whether they need an introduction or whether or not they think they're perfectly well steeped in the whole idea of being able to measure and use the data. So I want to thank you for actually introducing and putting all of this down on paper and getting people to roll with it. Dan, if you woke up tomorrow morning, somebody gave you a magic wand, a cup of coffee, you can discuss why somebody would be giving you a magic wand when you first wake up, and said that you had the power to change any two things that affected predictability, what would those two things be and why?
So that's pretty easy, because I do think that predictability does actually, and I don't know if we talked about this before, because you kind of read my mind with this question. I really do believe that predictability does distill down to two things, and pretty much only two things. To get good at predictability, to understand predictability, you need to, number one, control work in progress. And we haven't really talked too much about work in progress, which is interesting. I think we've been talking for about 40 minutes yet, and we haven't really talked too much about work in progress. But number one, control work in progress, because the more things that you work on at any given time, the less chance you have at being predictable. But number two, probably more important than work in progress. And I think a lot of people, I might be stepping on some toes in the Kanban community, but I really do feel like the more important thing than limiting work in progress is to actually pay attention to the age of items in progress. So if you do those two things, if you control work in progress, if we control the number of things that we're working on at the same time, and then while we're working on these things, we pay attention to how long they're actually taking to get done, and then obviously take action on either of those things. That would be my hope for the world, was that if they did those two things, the rest of this stuff really honestly takes care of itself. It really does.
So why do we care about the age and whether or not something's getting older?
Well, because what we want, to me, the idea of predictability is having as early a signal as possible that things are going wrong, or things are potentially going wrong. And the problem with metrics like cycle time and throughput is that you actually have to get stuff done before you can get that measure, right? I have to finish something before I know how long the cycle time was. Well, if things are taking too long and we wait till it finishes to do something about it, well, guess what? We're way too late. So there's this idea of we have to be much, much proactive. We need a much earlier signal that something is potentially going off the rails. And that's where the aging comes in.
I think you also make a point in the book that those things that get too old tend to get even older.
Delay begets delay. Yeah.
You're right. So we look at output measures, but if we have to wait until the end, then we wait until the end. And it's a signal to do something about something that's already occurred.
Right.
Dan, I know there's probably a ton more that we could talk through, and there are a number of things that I've jotted down. It's like, but so I think at some point I'd love to cycle back. Perhaps the last time I checked on LeanPub, the new book, When Will It Be Done, is about 80% done.
Yes, yeah. And soon, probably, I have like an 85% chance of it being complete, actually 100% complete in the next couple of weeks. So just some final editing on the last section that needs to finish, and then the book will be 100% complete.
Just again, this might be too inside, but why LeanPub? Why not? I'm sure that the larger publishing world has seen the impact of actionable agile metrics for predictability. Why go down the path of LeanPub?
I went down the path of LeanPub just because I was really drawn to its publishing model in general. This idea of publish early and publish often and get feedback. I mean, it's essentially eating our own dog food in terms of writing a book. And back when I started down the path of the first book, LeanPub was really the best option for that. Now I know a lot of the other publishing houses I think have caught up to that concept nowadays, but I enjoyed my experience with LeanPub so much, and I had, such good luck with it that for the second book, I decided just to go back. I mean, it's just, for me, it's a wonderful publishing platform.
Super. Dan, if people wanted to continue the conversation, how would they go about doing that?
Just go ahead and reach out to me. It's daniel@actionableagile.com, or you can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Dan Vacanti. That's V as in Victor, ACANTI.
Dan, this has been absolutely fantastic. As a thank you, I open up the platform at the end here for my interviewees to promote anything they'd like. We've been at the podcast now for roughly 12 years. There's probably another 12 or 13 years worth of people to talk to, and this will be around for that time. Selling your car on eBay is probably not the right thing to promote, but if you want, the platform is yours.
Okay, thank you. If I can maybe take a little bit of advantage and promote two things, if possible. Number one, there is a tool that we have put out along that is essentially an implementation of all the concepts in the book. It's called Actionable Agile Analytics. It's available as a plugin for Kanban-Eyes, as a plugin for Jira, soon to be a plugin for Visual Studio, or as a standalone. So you can go to the website, actionableagile.com, and learn more about that. So if you're truly serious about these metrics, I would highly encourage you to check out this tool. Because unfortunately, all of that tooling that I mentioned, unfortunately, they just don't do these metrics very well. So that's number one. And then number two, so I'm part of an organizer for a conference called Lean Agile US. And at this conference, we have assembled, what I believe is, probably the most amazing lineup of speakers. I can say this because it's my conference, right? In North America for all of 2018. Next year, Tom, I want you to come down and present. By the way, please do check us out. LeanAgileUS.com. It's in Fort Lauderdale at the end of February. So those of you guys who are living in the north have no excuse not to come down to Fort Lauderdale, enjoy some of this sunshine, this warm weather, and this sunshine, and, have a little fun and learn a little bit of Agile at the same time.
Sounds like a plan. Daniel S. Vacanti, author of Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability and Introduction, and soon, actually, you can go and buy the new book on LeanPub. The new book is titled When Will It Be Done? Thank you for participating on the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Yeah, Tom, thank you. Like I said, thank you very much for the invitation. I am extremely indebted to you for giving the exposure to the book and to some of the things I talk about that you've been giving both on this podcast, on Twitter. So thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of that ride. I really do appreciate it.
My pleasure. In Reread Saturday news, we will begin the full-scale reread of L. David Marquet's Turn the Ship Around next week. and I am really stoked. Remember to buy your copy and listen to the interview I did with Mr. Marquet back in 2002. To get involved in the reread, I'm going to lead the reread from my 2012 copy. The book has 29 chapters, not including the foreword, a cast of characters, index, afterword, and a glossary. The book is an easy read because Marquet is an excellent communicator. My intent is to knock out the preface materials next week and then begin delivering 2 chapters a week. It is my estimate. If my estimating ability holds true, we will complete our reread in 18 weeks. In upcoming conferences and webinars, Quest 2018, I'm doing my presentation titled The Three Amigos Role in Agile. Quest is May 21st through 25th in San Antonio, Texas. I'll be there for at least a couple of days. Let's connect. Link in the show notes to register, by the way. ISMA 2015. ISMA 15. It will be held May 11th in Rome, Italy. I look forward to seeing you in Rome and discussing agile metrics, function points. We can do that at the conference and afterwards over a drink. I'll also be at Agile West on June 7th, talking product owners. By the way, June 7th is my birthday. The Software Process and Measurement Cast 487 opens with our essay, Don't Shortcut Shuhari. I spend several hours every week running. I do that on purpose, by the way. I don't run very fast, which means when I have the occasional fall because my mind wanders, I inflict very little damage on the ground. This is a preamble to letting you know that I have lots of time to think when I run, which is the reason the ground occasionally gets in my way, by the way. Recently, I've been thinking about just how rigorously practitioners need to follow processes, methods, and frameworks, and when it makes sense, to tweak the process to fit the culture. Our second column will introduce a new column from Susan Parente. Susan's new column is titled, I Am Not a Scrumdimentalist. Susan originally appeared on SPaMCAST 344, and there's a link in the show notes to that, so you can start to get a sense of Susan. Our final column in the SPaMCAST 487 features John Quigley, who brings his Alpha and Omega product development column to the cast. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?